Do you really think the President of the United States can't be touched? Do you actually believe that the Oval Office, the so-called most powerful seat on earth, is safe from a man who crawled out of a swamp with blood on his hands and bribes in his pocket? Think again. Because if you follow the whispers, if you pull at the threads buried in FBI files, courtroom transcripts, and the urban legends that still hang like fog over the French Quarter, you'll find something chilling, that one of the shortest men in American organized crime may have reached further, darker, and higher than any of the giants. His name was Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans Godfather. Barely 5 feet tall, and yet there are men who swear he toppled a president. Now pause and really consider that. America in the 1960s loved to imagine itself as invincible, armored in nuclear weapons and booming industry, led by a golden boy from Massachusetts with Hollywood charm. And yet, behind the brass bands of Bourbon Street, behind the shrimp boats of the Gulf, there was a man running his empire like a swamp kingdom, untouchable, unmovable, invisible. He controlled the docks, the unions, the politicians, even the judges who swore to bring justice. He wasn't just another mobster with greasy hands in the till. He was the system. And when John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert decided to declare war on the Mafia, they weren't just poking at shadows in New York or Chicago. They were poking at Carlos Marcello. And the question that has haunted America for 60 years is this: did they pay the ultimate price? But here's the darker possibility, the part that makes this story speculative, almost supernatural. Maybe Marcello's power wasn't just about bribes and bullets. Maybe it was structural. Maybe he built an empire so deeply woven into the bones of New Orleans that even death couldn't kill it. Think about that. A hidden architecture of control, where the shrimp on your dinner plate, the bananas unloaded from freighters, the very highways built with union labor, all of it was taxed, touched or tilted by a man who lived behind a modest garden in Jefferson Parish. The scariest monsters are never the ones you see with guns drawn. The scariest ones are the ones you never see at all. So tonight, as you drift into this story, don't expect the cartoon gangster cliches. No Tommy guns spraying alleys. No pinstripe suits bathed in neon light. Expect something quieter, heavier. Expect to meet a man who ran his empire, not like a gangster, but like a king. A man who may have reached into the very heart of American history and squeezed. Ask yourself this before we begin. If it's even possible that Carlos Marcello helped kill a president, then what else might he have gotten away with? Chapter 1. The Godfather of the Gulf. They called him Carlos Marcello. But in New Orleans, he was simply the boss. He was not tall, barely 5 feet tall, in fact. And yet this small, wiry Sicilian immigrant cast a shadow so vast that it stretched from the French Quarter to Washington D.C., touching everything from shrimp boats on the Gulf to the Oval Office itself. Born Calogero Minicore in 1910, his family had fled the crumbling poverty of Sicily only to be dumped into the humid swamp of Louisiana, where the smell of decay hung over the streets like a shroud. But poverty breeds two things: desperation and genius, and Marcello possessed both in lethal measure. By the time he was a teenager, he had already swapped his family's fishing nets for dice, numbers, and smuggled liquor. He rose quickly, his sharp mind learning that in New Orleans, crime wasn't just tolerated, it was woven into the very fabric of the city, as permanent as the wrought iron balconies and jazz pouring from Bourbon Street. Unlike Chicago or New York, where the Mafia fought for survival against the glare of tabloids and the fury of federal agents, New Orleans had a long, proud tradition of organized corruption. Since the late 1800s, the so-called Black Hand had sunk its roots into the Crescent City, feeding off its port, its vice, its politics. Marcello didn't just inherit that system, he perfected it, transforming New Orleans into one of the most efficient mafia capitals in America. A city where every oyster shucked, every gallon of oil refined, every ballot cast was taxed in blood and silence. And here is where the story grows frightening. By the 1940s and 50s, Marcello had not only seized control of New Orleans, but had carved himself into the American underworld as a kingmaker whose reach extended beyond state lines. His rackets were not the flashy casinos of Las Vegas or the brothels of Chicago. They were deeper, quieter, harder to untangle. He owned the docks, which meant every crate unloaded carried his unseen toll. He controlled the fruit companies, importing bananas and produce, not just for Louisiana, but for half the South, legitimate businesses that doubled as pipelines for narcotics. He ran slot machines in bars, clubs, and corner stores, a nickel at a time, feeding an empire worth millions. And unlike other bosses, he did not crave the limelight. His power was like the humid air, thick, unseen, and suffocating. FBI files suggest that by the early 1960s, his operations generated over $50 million annually, equivalent to more than $500 million today. That staggering wealth did not merely buy Cadillacs and mansions. It bought judges, governors, congressmen. The scariest part? He made himself indispensable. The politicians who railed against corruption in public shook his hand in private. Police chiefs who swore to crack down on the Mafia turned a blind eye in exchange for envelopes fat with cash. And through it all, Marcello smiled, never raising his voice, always reminding people that in New Orleans, survival depended on understanding who truly owned the city. But the legend of Carlos Marcello takes on a darker, almost mythic quality when you examine the whispers that still linger around his name. He was not content to rule one city. He dreamed of ruling history itself. In the early 1960s, when President John F. Kennedy declared war on organized crime, Marcello allegedly snarled to an associate, "Don't buy the horse, buy the jockey." What did he mean? Some claim it was his chilling way of suggesting that if you can't bribe the president, you remove him. And so begins the most disturbing rumor of all, that Marcello was not merely a mafia boss, but a hidden hand in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The Warren Commission dismissed it. The FBI downplayed it. But historians, journalists, and even some former mob insiders have pointed to Marcello as one of the most likely architects of the crime of the century. The theory suggests that Kennedy's war on the Mafia and his brother Robert's relentless crusade as Attorney General posed such a threat to Marcello's empire that he struck back in the most permanent way possible. It is a claim impossible to prove, and yet impossible to kill, because every thread of the story seems to lead back to New Orleans, to the little man who owned a city. Whether true or not, the fact that it remains plausible speaks volumes about the kind of power Marcello wielded. He was not just a gangster. He was a phantom king, ruling the Gulf with a smile and a knife hidden in the folds of his tailored suit. Chapter 2. The Swamp Kingdom. To understand why Carlos Marcello's legend still sends shivers down spines, you must first understand the unique terrain of New Orleans, a city built on contradictions, half on land, half on water, half in America, half in some older, stranger world. Swamps surrounded it, hurricanes threatened it, and poverty gnawed at its edges. But New Orleans thrived because it was lawless in spirit, and in that chaos, Marcello found his kingdom. Unlike the bosses of New York, who ruled over vertical empires of skyscrapers and unions, Marcello ruled a horizontal empire spread across the swamps and ports of Louisiana, stretching outward like an oil slick into Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. His genius was logistics. He understood that the Gulf of Mexico was a golden artery, and he positioned himself as its gatekeeper. Every shrimp boat, every freighter, every shipment of bananas that passed through the docks was subject to his tax, and more than just goods passed through. Heroin, smuggled from Europe and South America, flowed into New Orleans, disguised in crates of fruit, feeding an epidemic that made Marcello richer by the day. By the 1960s, federal reports claimed that as much as 70% of America's heroin entered through Marcello's ports. If true, that makes him not just a mob boss, but one of the architects of an addiction crisis that destroyed countless lives. And yet, unlike the flamboyant traffickers of later decades, Marcello's name rarely appeared in newspapers. He understood invisibility. He lived quietly in a farmhouse in Jefferson Parish, raising vegetables, as though he were nothing more than a humble gardener. But that garden, some whispered, grew on blood-soaked soil, What makes his story especially chilling is how deeply he entwined himself with politics. Marcello was not a man who merely bribed a policeman to look the other way. He invested in power like other men invest in real estate. Governors, senators, even congressmen allegedly owed their campaigns to him. His tentacles reached as far as Washington, D.C., where Southern politicians turned a blind eye to his operations in exchange for steady streams of money. In one infamous case, Marcello allegedly arranged for a Louisiana judge who had opposed him to be found drunk and disgraced in a hotel room with prostitutes, a warning that in his swamp kingdom, careers could be ended with a snap of his fingers. The FBI tried repeatedly to nail him. In 1961, Robert F. Kennedy had him deported to Guatemala in a secret operation, hoping to strip him of his throne, but Marcello simply bribed his way back into the U.S. and returned to New Orleans like a king reclaiming his crown. The fact that the government of the United States tried to exile him and failed is perhaps the most powerful testimony to his reach. What kind of man can be thrown out of a country, dumped in a foreign land, and yet walk back home as if nothing had happened? Only a man who knows the system is his to command. And yet, beneath the history lies the myth, the ghost story. Old-timers in New Orleans still whisper that Marcello had his own network of swampside graves, places where rivals and traitors were fed not to the earth, but to the alligators. They call it Bayou Justice, a punishment so final that no body, no evidence, no crime remained. FBI reports list dozens of men who vanished after crossing him, their names ending in a single word, missing. And so the legend endures, that Marcello's swamp kingdom was not just an empire of money, but of silence, where the waters themselves kept his secrets. Some even say his power never truly died, that his system of bribery, control, and fear was so deeply woven into Louisiana politics that it still hums beneath the surface today. That every time a port deal is struck, every time a politician in Louisiana is caught in scandal, Marcello's ghost is somewhere in the background, smiling. If Tommy Lucchese was the architect of silence in New York, then Carlos Marcello was the gardener of shadows in the South, tending his swamp kingdom until it grew into something larger than one man, larger even than death itself. Chapter 3. The President and the Ghost of New Orleans. To speak of Carlos Marcello without speaking of John F. Kennedy is to tell only half the ghost story, because if New York had Lucky Luciano, if Chicago had Al Capone, then New Orleans had Marcello, and Marcello, some claim, had the president's life in his hands. The connection begins with Robert F. Kennedy, who as Attorney General in the early 1960s launched an unprecedented war against organized crime. Unlike J. Edgar Hoover, who downplayed the Mafia's existence for decades, Bobby Kennedy had no illusions. He named names, subpoenaed bosses, and turned the full force of the Justice Department against the underworld. But in his crusade, he made enemies of men who had lived in shadows for decades. None more dangerous than Carlos Marcello. The Kennedy brothers struck him where it hurt, ordering his sudden deportation in 1961. When government agents snatched him off the streets of New Orleans, stripped him of his citizenship, and dumped him in the jungles of Guatemala with no warning, the message was clear. His kingdom was over. But what did Marcello do? He bribed his way across borders, re-entered the United States illegally, and within months was back in Louisiana, smirking at the idea that a president could exile him from his own throne. That resilience became the seed of darker whispers, that Marcello was not only angry, but vengeful, and his vengeance would shape the nation's destiny. Here's where the shadows thicken. Multiple mob insiders, including Jack Van Lanningham, a former FBI informant, have claimed that Marcello confessed to orchestrating the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He allegedly said, "If you want to kill a dog, you don't cut off the tail, you cut off the head." In his mind, Robert Kennedy was the tail, John the head. Remove the head, and the war against organized crime collapses. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy's motorcade rolled through Dallas, Texas, well within Marcello's sphere of influence. The official Warren Commission would later declare Lee Harvey Oswald the lone gunman, a disaffected Marxist acting alone. But skeptics have long pointed to Marcello's New Orleans empire as the missing piece of the puzzle. After all, Oswald himself was born in New Orleans. He spent time there in 1963, passing out pro-Castro leaflets on the very streets where Marcello's men ruled. Was it coincidence, or was it a setup, a patsy chosen to deflect blame? To this day, researchers note strange overlaps. Oswald's connections to David Ferry, a pilot and associate of Marcello, Ferry's later suspicious death, whispers that Jack Ruby, who silenced Oswald in Dallas, had ties to Marcello's gambling rackets. Each piece alone is tenuous. Together, they form a shadow so vast it darkens history itself. And what if it's true? What if a 5-foot-tall mob boss from New Orleans reached into the corridors of American power and plucked the life of a president like a man removing a chess piece? If that is the case, then Carlos Marcello was not simply a gangster. He was the architect of one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century. FBI records released under the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act have only deepened the mystery. Some documents suggest Marcello was under surveillance in the months before and after the assassination, that agents considered him a serious suspect, and yet he was never charged, never brought to trial for it. Why? Perhaps because to indict Marcello would have been to indict the system itself, to admit that America's highest office could be felled not by a foreign enemy, but by a swamp king from Louisiana. That is the terror of the Marcello story. It blurs the line between conspiracy and reality so tightly that the two cannot be separated, whether he ordered Kennedy's death or not. The fact remains, millions of Americans believe he did, and sometimes the belief itself is more powerful than the fact. Chapter 4. The city that served two masters. To understand the true weight of Carlos Marcello's reign, you must imagine New Orleans not as a single city, but as two overlapping cities, one that existed in daylight and one that breathed at night by daylight. Tourists walked through Jackson Square, brass bands filled the air, and politicians gave speeches about progress. But at night, or even in the quiet corners of daylight, the second city hummed. It was the city of Marcello, where judges bent their gavels at his command, where cops closed cases before they began, where businesses survived only if they paid their hidden tax. His empire was built less like an army and more like a government. He collected revenue, enforced laws, punished traitors, and provided protection. By the 1950s, many New Orleanians quietly acknowledged the truth. Marcello's approval mattered more than the mayor's. In a city plagued by hurricanes, crime, and corruption, Marcello was the one stable element, the silent hand that ensured order. But his order came at a price. For every politician he kept afloat, another vanished. For every business he saved, another was crushed. His city was not ruled by ballots or laws, but by whispers and envelopes, by fear and loyalty. Even today, the scars of that dual city remain. Historians estimate that Marcello's empire at its peak controlled rackets worth over $500 million annually in modern terms. From the docks to the French Quarter, from shrimp boats to skyscrapers, his fingerprints lingered everywhere. Rumors persist that construction projects, bridges, roads, even parts of the Superdome carried his hidden tax. Workers would find crates of materials short, delays engineered, strikes mysteriously timed, all designed to funnel cash into Marcello's coffers. Some even whisper of bodies buried in the swamps during those projects. Disloyal union men, rival contractors, politicians who promised reform and then wavered. The swamps themselves became his enforcers, their murky waters swallowing evidence with a silence no jury could challenge. This is why Marcello remains frightening, not because of what he admitted, but because of what can never be proven. His empire dissolved into the city itself, until the line between legal and illegal, between honest politician and bought official, was blurred beyond recognition. And here lies the haunting possibility. What if Marcello's city never died? What if his design was so effective that pieces of it survive even now, disguised in legitimate corporations, washed clean by decades, but still humming with his ghostly touch. Old men in New Orleans whisper that some families still pay ghost taxes to faceless entities, that certain trucking companies and seafood distributors still operate with rules set long before they were born. Economists note that Marcello's infiltration of commerce was so deep that unraveling it would have meant collapsing entire industries. In that sense, perhaps he achieved what most mob bosses only dreamed of: immortality. Not in bloodlines or headlines, but in systems. Systems so quiet, so invisible, that they continue long after the man himself was buried in Metairie Cemetery in 1993, and so New Orleans remains a haunted city. Not by ghosts in white sheets, but by a legacy of silence. A place where jazz hides screams, where Mardi Gras masks corruption, and where the shadow of a little man named Carlos Marcello still lingers, as if the swamp itself remembers. Chapter 5. The Fall That Never Really Fell. By the late 1970s and 80s, the federal government had shifted its gaze more sharply toward Carlos Marcello, determined to finally dismantle the swamp kingdom he had built brick by brick, bribe by bribe. But Marcello was not an ordinary gangster you could catch with a briefcase of cash or a shipment of heroin. His genius was distance. He placed layers of men between himself and the crimes, operating less like a criminal and more like a head of state. But even kings grow old, and in 1981, the Justice Department launched Operation Brylab, an undercover sting aimed at exposing insurance fraud, bribery, and political corruption. The investigation netted Marcello in its web, alongside powerful Louisiana politicians. Hidden tapes allegedly captured him discussing payoffs and corruption schemes, his soft Sicilian voice confirming what many already believed, that the man running Louisiana was not sitting in the governor's mansion, but in Marcello's modest office. Convicted in 1981 and sentenced to prison, he seemed at last to have fallen. Newspapers wrote of his final chapter, of the death of an empire. But even here, the truth is slipperier, because Marcello, unlike so many mob bosses who ended their lives in prison or in a pool of blood, managed to wriggle free. He appealed his conviction, fought for years in the courts, and in 1989, after serving less than a decade, his conviction was overturned. Just like that, the Swamp King walked out of prison, frail but undefeated, a ghost who had slipped from the gallows once more. And what does that tell us? It tells us that Marcello did not fall in the way history loves its villains to fall. Capone rotted from syphilis. Gotti died in chains. Luciano was exiled into obscurity. But Marcello? He returned home. He spent his last years quietly in Louisiana, still wealthy, still whispered about, still feared. When he finally died in 1993 of natural causes, he was not a broken man in prison blues. He died in his bed, in his own home, with his family nearby. In the Mafia world, that is a miracle. Or perhaps something darker, a bargain. Did Marcello survive, not because of luck, but because he had built something so deeply rooted in Louisiana's soil that even federal prosecutors could not dig it out? Some suggest that even in his later years, weakened and in ill health, politicians still visited him, seeking his blessing. Businessmen still called him, asking for permission. His name still commanded respect and silence. If true, then his fall was no fall at all. It was simply a fade, a slow dimming of a light that had burned too long. Today, historians and conspiracy theorists alike debate the size of his shadow. Was he merely a powerful regional boss, or was he the mastermind behind the Kennedy assassination? Was his empire dismantled, or does it still hum quietly in the background of Louisiana politics and industry? We will likely never know, but perhaps that uncertainty is his greatest victory. For a man like Carlos Marcello to be remembered not just in court records but in whispers, in shadows, in the uneasy suspicion that he may have reshaped American history itself, that is immortality. He was not just the boss of New Orleans. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of it. Charming and corrupt, vibrant and dangerous, beautiful and haunted all at once. And maybe, just maybe, when the swamp fog rises on certain nights, when Bourbon Street grows quiet and the French Quarter seems to hold its breath, the ghost of Carlos Marcello still walks, reminding us that some men never truly leave the cities they once owned. And so the story of the New Orleans Mafia boss drifts to an end, not with the thunder of gunfire or the clang of prison doors, but with the quiet shuffle of a man who outlasted every storm. Carlos Marcello was not the loudest, not the tallest, not even the most violent of America's gangsters, but he was perhaps the most enduring. He built an empire out of shadows, ruled a city that served two masters, and carried whispers so dark they still echo through history. His story is not just crime, it is myth, conspiracy, and the strange truth that sometimes the smallest men cast the longest shadows. Now, as you let these words fade into the background, think of New Orleans. Not just the jazz, the parades, the laughter, but the silence beneath it all. The silence of secrets, the silence of power, the silence of a man who was once called the Godfather of the Gulf. And as you close your eyes, let that silence soften into rest, knowing that the ghosts of history are far away, their whispers dissolving into dreams. Tonight, you are safe. Tonight, the swamp is quiet. Tonight, the story fades, leaving only the stillness of sleep.